The Emerald Knight, Chapter 14. Clem was loading his saddlebags when Xandra approached him, and he nearly dropped them. It was rare to see her in the stables. In fact, he couldn't remember the last time that he had. She rarely went riding, and if she did have somewhere to go, she normally had a groomsman drive her. She had no attendants, which Clem didn't like since he had just found out the threat had been made on her life. She noticed the concern on his face and smiled. "Are you all right?" she asked him. "I'm sorry about earlier," he said, averting his eyes, then opened his mouth to say that he was an idiot, but couldn't figure out how to articulate that thought without making her angry, so he said nothing. She didn't like it when he put himself down. She considered him her champion, and he was pretty sure that his failures were bad enough without him speaking them out loud and reminding her. "You don't want to go?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "It isn't that." He jerked towards her so quickly the horse started, and he put one hand on her side to steady her. "I just got confused. I'm sorry. It's hard for me to think in front of big crowds." "Is it?" she asked, and he felt his face heating up. "How comforting. Most men wouldn't be so humble with the honors that you've been given." "Thank you," he said, and went back to loading his horse to disguise the pink creeping across his features. "It must be difficult," she continued. "I don't think that other people realize how much trouble you have. Prophecy can be a heavy burden." "Thank you," he said again, and turned to her with a sincere smile. She was the only one who understood, even a little, that his position did weigh on him. "Especially for you." She gingerly stepped into the stall and moved closer to him. "You're so stoic in public. I doubt the rest of the court understands how sensitive you are." She reached one delicate gloved hand out and traced the smooth curve of his cheek. He leaned into the touch and stared down at her dumbly, trying to think of something to say. It was so intimate. Did it mean something? No, no, of course not. He was just projecting, just wishful thinking. "I will be frightened, you know," she told him. "Without having you by my side, I only feel safe because I have my sacred guardian to protect me." "I'll hurry," he promised, because it was all he could think to say. His skin where she touched tingled even through her gloves, and he wanted more. He wanted to feel her bare skin, though he knew it was a ridiculous desire. He slowly reached up and settled the tips of his fingers on her wrist, and she did not pull away. "We shall have a feast upon your return," she promised, and Clint did not remember that as a child he had questioned how the royalty went through so much food. Those were the sorts of things he thought about when his family had been forced to give up most of what they grew. But that was a long time ago, and he hadn't done anything like field work in years. He had become disconnected. So he smiled. "I haven't been to the sacred woods in years," he said, because he wanted the conversation to continue, not because he thought that she would find it interesting. She knew where he was, and he realized that it had been a stupid thing to say the instant it left his mouth. "I dare say they will be pleased to see you," she mused, staring into his eyes. "Any holy ground would benefit from a visit from the chosen one." Clint felt his knees trying to give out, and he pretended he had no idea why. He would not admit that he was in love with a queen, would not allow himself to bring that thought to the surface so that it could be crushed. He didn't want the heartache. He tightened his fingers around her wrist, and she stroked the skin just under his eyes with her thumb. "Your eyes," she said, and did not finish the thought. "I'm sorry." He sighed because he was so used to having to atone for them. "I guess I should get going. It's a few days' ride to the temple, and I don't want to leave you any longer than I have to." "Take a battalion of royal guards with you," she advised, and she slowly lowered her hand from his face, though she did not pull away from his grip. "The same group that threatens me threatens you. Though I do not doubt your skill, I would be unable to live without you, should the unthinkable—" The arm that he still held trembled with the rest of her body, and he stared at her. He fell to one knee and forced his brain to stall. If he thought about it, he knew he wouldn't do it. He moved his hand until he was holding her fingers between his thumb and forefinger and pressed his lips to the back of her glove. When he had accomplished this goal, he allowed his thoughts to flow again, and a wave of overpowering anxiety racked every nerve in his body. Run. He stayed, rooted to the spot, pretending that he wasn't going to have a stroke or a heart attack until Xandra squeezed his hand in hers. "I await your return with bated breath, Sir Clin," she said as she withdrew her hand and turned to make her way out of the stables. Clem was dying, he was sure of it. The muscles in his chest had seized, and he held his dominant hand there as he stayed on one knee, breathing slowly, feeling his lungs expand and contract, leaning forward and bracing himself with his other hand so he didn't just fall face first into the straw. She hadn't pulled away. She had let him touch her. She had let him kiss her. He was going to die. His entire body seemed to be seizing up, and he was going to die. He could not articulate what was wrong with him, but he knew he was going to die, and he didn't care because she had let him kiss her. He pulled himself up by the stall fence and took deep, expansive breaths, trying to force himself to calm down. He pointedly ignored his entire lower body as his mind began working properly, and he realized what a stupid thing he had just done. Xandra was a queen, and she was going to marry into royalty. It was only a matter of time before she picked one of her many suitors. He wasn't a candidate. The best he could hope for, and he did hope for it, was to become the illicit affair, the handsome, dashing young knight who she turned to for affection when her noble husband was unable to— "Oh, shut the fuck up," he said aloud to his own mind. He wasn't going to let that picture fully form. Instead, he finished dressing his horse, he took her by the reins and led her from the box stall, and confusion hit him as he let his eyes drift over the semicircle of people standing in his way. There was no way past them, because they stood in formation, blocking his escape from every direction. One of them, in a uniform symbolizing his rank as their leader, stepped forward and spoke. "Good morning, sir. We're ready to leave on your command." "Sir." Clin looked over the half-dozen soldiers, real soldiers, assembled, and understood what Xandra really meant. She didn't believe that he could retrieve an artifact by himself. And that was probably wise. She was probably right. It would be much easier to convince the priestesses to allow him access to the most holy parts of the temple if he came in armed with real weapons and trained soldiers. He didn't want to rely on intimidation, but it may be his only real hope of completing the mission. "Well," he said after he had taken in these facts, "I'm ready to go." They stood there staring at him as if they expected him to say more, so he added, "So, you're in charge, then? What's your name?" "In charge, sir?" the leader asked him, with confusion distorting his features. "I suppose that would be accurate, yes. I'll be reporting directly to you, sir. My name is Ruvian, sir." He bowed forward slightly, and Clin stared at him in disbelief. Can you not do that?" Clin asked, because the kiss had made him more bold than he normally felt. "Call me sir like that, or at least not every other word?" "Yes, sir," Ruvian said, and immediately caught himself and corrected to, "Yes, chosen one." "Clin," Clin sighed, "is my name." They stood in awkward silence while Ruvian straightened himself back up to his full height so that he, like most people, towered over Clin by several inches. They stood there while Clin became more anxious and annoyed before he finally asked, "So, can y'all move? You're blocking me. I don't really like being wedged in." "Our orders are to flank you for the duration of the trip, sir," Ruvian explained. "We cannot allow any harm to come to you." Clin sighed. That sounded annoying, but he had seen it before with the real knights. They would ride in the center of a formation in case any assassination attempts were made. The assassins would have to fight through their contingent of guards to reach them. He didn't like it, but he had grown accustomed to doing things which he didn't like and merely accepted it. "I'm gonna go on outside," he told the group, and brushed past Ruvian. Two of the others moved aside for him, staring at him as he passed in a type of quiet revelry. He heard one of them speaking as he passed and gritted his teeth as he tried to ignore it. "An entire regiment," she was saying, "with the sacred sword." They rode until nightfall with little banter. Clyn was all too well aware that they were afraid to speak in his presence, afraid that he harbored some secret grudge about being watched over like a child, most likely, and that he would act on it in the rage that everyone seemed to believe he felt. A few hours after sunset, they came to a stop beside a river, and the soldiers around him began to make camp. Clint ignored them because he had no desire to deal with nonsense, and he had come to learn that most social interaction was merely some form of nonsense. And instead, what about staking his horse? He didn't believe that she would desert him, and tied it so loosely that she could probably undo the rope or pull up the stake if she really wanted. He wasn't overly concerned, and no one was going to correct him. He could only drag out the task for so long before social convention and hunger forced him to sit by the fire his unit had built, and when he did, all conversation came to an end. He sighed and wondered if he really needed to eat dinner, if a meal was an acceptable trade-off for the iron in his stomach when he was forced to be around people who resented him. "We should arrive no later than noon on the 4th day at this pace," Ruvian said. "Were you guys talking about me?" Clint asked, because the sword told him that they were, and he didn't think before he opened his mouth. The soldiers exchanged guilty looks, except for one girl who nearly shouted, "No!" and fell silent. Clint rubbed his eyes, then looked back at the skewers cooking over the fire, cursing himself for speaking. "I swear I won't hurt you," he said after he had spent so long listening to the crackle of the flames that he could no longer bear it. "I swear it on my life." He stared into the flames to avoid looking at them, and quickly added, "So I'm just gonna go lay out my bedroll and go to sleep. Good night." He made the stand, but the girl put a hand gently on his arm, and he looked down at her. She was so dazzlingly normal, he realized, after being so long among the nobility, with dark skin and hair and eyes the color of moss. She was beautiful, but not in the same way the nobles were. Her muscles were just as defined as his, her face as sun-baked and battle-hardened, and her eyes twinkled up at him in wonder. "How many of the rumors are true?" she asked him. "I don't know," he said, and shrugged the shoulder that would not dislodge her. "They say that you killed not only the rebels, but the king's personal guard," she continued, staring at him with her eyes wide. Clint sighed, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, opened them, and stared at the sea of faces around the crackling campfire. "What is wrong with you?" Ruvian hissed, staring at her as if she were mad. Clint began, and thoughts raced through his mind of faces and blood and bodies and Sandra in her perfect night clothes, and the sword burned on his back. He moved his hand away from the hilt when he realized it was there and looked down at the girl. He must have jerked away from her, but she didn't look frightened. She still held her hand out, hovering, as if she wanted to touch him, but dared not let herself. He held his left wrist in his right hand and forced it against his chest before he spoke again, in a quiet voice. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I don't want to." "Please, sir, stay and eat something," she said, and Clint willed his breathing to slow, tried to pretend that he wasn't upset, tried to forget that awful night. "I don't," Clint began, stopped, and started again. "Everyone, listen. I know that you don't like me and you don't want to be here. I'm sorry that you got stuck babysitting when you should be working. We'll go in, we'll get the artifact, and get out. It'll be fast and you can all return to your lives." Sir Clint, Ruvian stood, put his hand over his heart, and bowed slightly, and Clint stared at him in confusion because those were the motions one went through when addressing their superiors. "If I may speak freely." Clint continued to stare because he had absolutely no idea how to respond to that. Ruvian glanced up and saw the confusion on his face and realized many things. The chief among them was that he was looking at a boy. A child. Clem was only 17, and he looked even younger. For an elf, he wasn't anywhere near the end of his childhood, yet here he stood, trying to lead a troop with no formal training and no experience into what he didn't even seem to understand was going to be a fight. "Clin," he said, and the boy's gaze snapped to him. "This is not the training grounds. You are not on a schoolyard. No one is going to babysit you, and you need to understand that. We are here to support you, not to watch over you. If you don't feel that you are capable of leadership, you can step down." "Wait, I can do that?" Clint's eyes widened. "That's an option?" "Not one that I would suggest," Rivian explained. "The Queen made it very clear that we were to follow your orders, but you seem incapable of giving any orders." He stared him down while Clint fidgeted with the neckline of his tunic and asked, "How old are you?" though he already knew the answer. 17, Clint replied instantly, with the voice of a student, exactly as he had been trained to address his teachers when he had been training for the knighthood. "You trained at the palace?" Rivian asked, dropping the salute and standing to his full height. "Yes, sir," Clint said, and it flowed from his tongue so naturally that the other soldiers sat back. "Who did you train under?" Rivian asked, ignoring the slip completely. "No one, sir." Clint didn't even seem to register that he was doing it. "No master would take me." "You aren't prepared for this at all, are you?" Rivian watched the boy, who had moved his hand down his chest and held it there exactly as if he were addressing his superior. "No, sir," Clint admitted with no hesitation. "Why?" "I didn't know I would have to, sir," Clint explained, still speaking exactly as he had in his training. "And I don't want to, sir. I grew up around that temple. I don't know if I can take something holy from it. It feels like desecration." A murmur went along the edges of the campfire, and Ruvian turned to his underlings. "Enough! You will respect your superiors, and no one else is going to bother the Chosen One with nonsense about his past. No one will spread any rumors, no one will ask him any stupid questions, and no one will question him when he says he is going to do something. Clin!" Clint jumped and nearly stumbled over the log he had been sitting on. He managed to get his footing and stand straight up again. "Yes, sir?" he asked. "Call me sir again, boy, and I will take that sword from your back and plunge it into your heart. I don't care if it eats the flesh from my bones. Do you understand me?" he asked, and Clint studied him. He was unfamiliar with the kind of thing he was seeing, and it took him a second to register it. Teasing. Rufian was joking with him at his expense. He didn't know how to respond to it. People didn't include him in jokes. I'll call you whatever I want, sir," he responded, hoping that he was socializing correctly. "It's my unit." Ruvian laughed, and giggles came up from the edges of the fire. Clint looked down at them as a smile spread across his face. He slowly lowered himself back and leaned forward just a little. No one pulled away from him. No one seemed afraid of him. The girl to his left slowly turned one of the skewers, and he watched her. He looked across the flickering flame and caught Rivian's eyes. The man was staring at him with a look that Clint didn't understand, wouldn't understand until he met Bruana. He had somehow moved beyond friendship, and identified Clint not as the chosen one, but as a child who needed guidance and protection. The man to his right pulled one of the skewers from the flames and bit into it, and the others followed suit. Before long, the camp was shrouded in silence, but Clint didn't fear it as he normally did. He was in a group of people who weren't talking, and his muscles weren't telling him to run. He chewed slowly and watched the faces around him do the same thing. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt a twinge of guilt when he realized that this was the first intimate meal he had shared with people since the death of his parents.